So every single time that my son had ever had anything to eat or drink, it was with me. And while some American women that work for CPS would look down on that because they have a different opinion of how a child should be raised, it's really none of their concern or business. Because supposedly in this country, I have a right to raise my child as I see fit, not as the state sees fit. And if I want to raise my child in along the lines of that's a little more closely aligned to maybe some of the parenting styles that some Asian countries have, where they co-sleep with their kids, or sometimes some of Latin American countries where they do the same thing. If I choose to develop a strong bond with my son, that's my business. And when the state traumatically separated my son, he quit eating because he didn't have his mother, who loved him, eating with him any longer. And even though we had a caring provider with him, I don't believe that every single time he was eating they were sitting down, and that's not how they raise their kids. And I know for a fact that that's not what they were doing with my son. And my son wanted me. What child, if given the choice, would not choose the mother who gives him their undivided attention? What child does not choose that mother? I mean, there is only one mother, and I am his mother. Yeah, it's... So when there was this speech therapy meeting, and he chose to go over to me and to eat with me and began to eat readily because he was hungry, because he didn't feel like eating with other people by himself. He felt less depressed, and he felt connected to me, and he began to eat. And then Michelle Erickson later accused my son, and wrote it up in her notes, claiming that my son had mental issues by stating in her notes that he was a binge eater. Okay, Michelle was, she's probably lost some weight now, but she was almost 200 pounds at the time that she was calling my son a binge eater. And she never forgave me, ever, for making that point of how much she weighed and how she was projecting her own problems onto my son, who was 1.5, a little over 1.5, a little less than 2 years old by the time he was at that appointment. And no, my son is not a binge eater. In fact, he had lost over 7 pounds from the time that he was taken away from me. Within 1 month, he lost 7 pounds because he was not eating, because he was so distraught. And of course, CPS and all the public defenders, they didn't want to get those records because there were documents to prove that that happened. And they didn't want to be accused of traumatizing my child and having evidence that proved that my son was traumatized by what they did, when that action was never necessary. They broke the law, they kidnapped my son, they created trauma and damages in my child, and all that they've ever done since is try to defame me, encourage others to defame me, to drug me, to use me for research, whatever it takes to keep me out of the way, and to keep people from believing what I say. So that's the kind of, aside from not scheduling a bus to arrive on time and refusing normal transportation accommodations, a whole number of things. I'm pretty sure that Michelle Erickson is connected to some of the same people that Alvaro Pardo is connected to. I am 100% sure of that. Maybe it's Carol Middleton. And so I guess you know, finding out that one of the individuals that I was forced to stay with is connected to her was just a very strange concern. I mean, it was a very natural concern and a very strange thing to find out. I mean, what kinds of things have they been getting away with for all these years? I'm pretty sure that those parents that were thrown into jail because of some alleged sex ring that was occurring in the town, I really think, look, in hindsight, now that I know what has happened to my son, I almost think that somebody just wanted those kids and wanted to use them for government research, because that area is using children and has used children for a very long time for that reason. My mother is proof. I guess since I've talked about some of the torture against my son and the different places that I was being forced to live, probably tomorrow maybe tonight I will look up some of the names of the people that I was having to deal with and then bring those up tomorrow. But the other thing that I need to go over, which will be coinciding with my son's torture and the various places that I was living, is going to be the court process. And I already mentioned what happened with the hearing, where the judge banned me and blocked me from taking any documentation of my son or evidence of torture. And I guess what I will talk about now is how, and I have already talked about the whole psychological evaluation process, and how I was trying for the longest time to do that and held up from having that done, and then tortured, you know, forced to go into dangerous circumstances and tortured while they did that to me. So I guess I will continue with what CPS was asking of me and what lawyers I had or did not have at the time that I came back from being tortured and assaulted in the Seattle area. Because at that point then, Michelle Erickson and the Attorney General were trying to claim, they were falsely claiming that I had abandoned my son for a month while I was over there. It was a little less than a month, but I was making reports of crime. I was not abandoning my son. And the only reason that I was there to begin with was because they forced me to go there, and they did not provide the transportation that they were required by law to provide. They were the cause of the damages. I did not choose to have those things happen to me. And when I got back to Wenatchee, I was basically being punished. I had my visitations decreased, and I kept asking for a lawyer, so finally the judge did say I could have a different public defender and to find somebody. And I didn't know who to find. I mean, the entire town, I had asked for change of venue because there was nobody in that area that was impartial. And I finally thought that I found someone. And her name was Julie. I'll have to look again and remember what her last name was. But I thought she was going to be fine, but I should have known. I do believe that Julie works alongside the state and the military. And I say that because I actually saw her in court. Someone invited me to go to a court hearing about a different woman who was having her kid taken away from her. And I saw her in court in action there first. And that was before my son was ever taken away from me, before people started making claims or were torturing me. And with that woman, the man's name was Michael. He was connected to the post office, I guess, and had a place out in the country. And after the Wenatchee police were telling me to move, why don't I just move out of the area, and after I had social services trying to bribe me with a ticket out of the state through Mary Bridges, Judge John Bridges' wife, I then was approached by this man who had some kind of a coin collection, and he wanted to show it to me, and he was always around the post office. I think he was a post office worker, or he was a retired postal worker. And he invited me, he was telling me about this friend that he had that lived with him, and how she'd had a stroke of some kind that left part of her body paralyzed or disabled. And since this had happened to her, her child was then made a ward of the court and then adopted eventually away from her. And the entire situation with that woman in particular, what he said to me was that she was physically disabled because she had had a stroke. And knowing what this government can do with technology, I actually seriously wonder why a healthy young woman like herself would have a stroke. I mean, yes, people have things happen to them. I know that. But something happened to her, natural or not, that caused her to have a stroke at a very young age. And supposedly she was one of the most beautiful women in the town. And she really wasn't so much anymore, I guess. But I guess she had dated a lot of law enforcement and had been possibly used, I don't know, by law enforcement in the area. I mean, she was possibly a woman who had been categorically abused and used by the lawyers there, the police, and the military as well. When I met her, I can't really remember her face too much. But I remember she did have a pretty face. There was something that was different about her. I don't remember if her teeth weren't very good anymore, or if her hair was a little bit frizzy and she was wearing clothes that were sort of dated maybe. But you could tell that she had been a very beautiful woman, and she still had an incredible, amazing figure. She had a beautiful figure. And she basically, in her 30s, I guess, late 30s, maybe 40, suddenly, one day, for no reason, had a complete stroke, which left her partially paralyzed on one side of her body. And possibly it was natural. However, I do know that there are a lot of things that can be made to look natural too. And if she was being abused in the town or used by a number of men, and they got worried at some point about her talking about it, it's possible that something happened to her that wasn't natural. If they felt that her child was going to be valuable to the government in some way, and they wanted that child, it's possible that something happened. And what I know is that I saw Julie acting as her attorney and before the judge in a hearing where she was trying to get parental rights. She's trying to get more visitation, or at least partial custody